Right now. Hi, everyone. It's Renee Cormier from the Fractional Referral Network. Today's guest is Tiffany Dougherty. She's the founder of Ardent Services, and she helps high-growth SMBs transform chaotic hiring into strategic, scalable and talent systems. And so she has a human-centered approach, and she uses a customized playbook. She partners with HR, talent acquisition, and fractional leaders to align people strategies with business goals without burnout. So welcome, Tiffany. Thank you for being on our call today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Um, I want to ask you just a few questions. So one is, you said that recruiting isn't just about execution, that it's actually a strategic function. Can you walk us through what that means for SMBs and why it matters more now than ever?
Sure, sure. And again, thank you so much for just opening up this topic. You'll probably see my brain light up like a Christmas tree when we're talking about this because intentional or not, I've been in recruiting for over 15 years now, and I've seen so many ebbs and flows and so many changes. Started in staffing, went to corporate, went out on my own, did the consulting thing, and worked with a lot of startups. And in every single environment, I understood very clearly that, if it doesn't make business sense, we don't do it, right? And if we weren't hitting those numbers. But what I feel is a little bit of a misnomer is that if you're hitting your numbers, that doesn't necessarily equal a good TA strategy. It doesn't equal, a good recruiting execution, like high-fiving each other at the end of Q1 and saying, awesome, we filled all of our positions. And then we're just going to be a snake eating our own tail by the end of Q3 when we're coming into Q4 and realizing, oh crud, we've got more of a bigger tidal wave in the Q1 coming up, in the next year. So I think that it's not just about hitting the numbers. The numbers, of course, tell the tape, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more. But it's going beyond that and asking why. I like to say it's a story of a thousand whys. I ask why a few different ways with every client. And if they can't answer it 10 times, we've got a problem. And if we can't answer it 20 times, we've probably still got some work to do. But those people that want to dig into the why is important. And when you think about SMBs specifically, I come in at very high growth stages in the last 10 years here. I'm coming into a lot of change management, a lot of different cooks in the kitchen, right? But if I am focusing on this talent acquisition side and I am not looking at how this can scale and how this survives once my brain leaves the room, we've got another problem. So that's another reason why we're not just looking at execution, and I'm not looking at my performance as a fractional leader or TA partner as just I hit my numbers, I hired all these people for you, we're good, right? That's worth the money you paid me. It goes much, much, much further beyond that.
Okay. So where do you see the biggest disconnect between HR and talent acquisition and high growth companies? And how do you help bridge that gap?
Yeah, I think the greatest joy of my consulting experience and in being, a fractional partner to these companies is in coming in and asking those whys and being just naturally curious. So TA and HR both impact the culture in very different ways. Again, it's a little bit of a misconception that, the whole weight of the recruiting strategy should fall on HR's shoulders. Recruiting to retention has really been my focus. I like looking, big picture and then drilling down into the pillars that support that function. But when there is trust between those two functions of the business, TA on the front end and let's say HR on the back end, that trust should look like collaborative project lists where what I'm doing impacts you. I'm clear and I'm understanding of that fact. It also might look like regular team meetings, not death by meetings, but let's sync up and let's not hoard resources. Let's not say this is my process, stay out of it. Let's be collaborative and have some shared responsibility there. I think that's been a real game changer, especially through the pandemic when all systems got smashed. Everyone was kind of smash and grabbing resources for their own department. And I was able to come in and just bring a little bit of that calm to the chaos and just be a true partner, just be an open and collaborative partner there.
So what are the signs that a company's hiring process is hurting more than it's helping?
All right. Well, I think that, like I said before, the numbers tell a story. And I've always been very, very, very careful and sometimes a little spicy in conversations about what numbers we're sharing with who and why. There's that why again. But what do we want to know? Where do we really want to drill down? So I can look at all the reports. I can do the data analytics and, aggregate some really cool, Power BI and presentations and spreadsheets and stuff. But there's no substitute for asking. So I can tell pretty quickly if you have not asked your hiring team and the collective team that's going to absorb, a person into their structure, what they want and what's needed. I can also tell, and that's an employee engagement, performance management, succession planning conversation that again is logically on the HR side of the house, right? Wrong. We need to bridge that gap again. And then also asking and having some intentional models to gather information throughout the process of recruiting to retention, you'll start to learn what it's really like for a person to transition from a candidate to an employee, or what happens when they fall off. So you can actually see where to dig in on some things. But I start to see some of those red flags when you have long delays between hiring events, long delays in time to fill. Those are just like high level numbers, but when I drill down into it, it's very different depending on the state of the company, what they're trying to do, where their priorities are. So it's not a stamp and repeat. It's not a one size fits all, but I can start to see some red flags, some little burning embers. And when I dig into it, it usually becomes a much clearer process of where we can start in a lot of these processes.
So your first move when you step in is to
Do current state assessments. I think that's that's the first step in my
sorry.
process. Yep. You're like, I'm giving you a layup, I'm giving you something, but the current state assessment, because I'm not going to come in with like, these are the standards for the season and for the year, and here's the new trend. Like, let's hit you over the head with an AI bat, to give you all the tools and resources there. Let's start with current state and make sure that you understand what your specific opportunities and your specific challenges are, and where your team's at, what they're ready for. And then I can develop some tiered solutioning. Let's start where you're at. Let's meet you where you're at. And maybe there's some solutions that can be a DIY. You can just take some of this and make it your own. There are some done for you solutions. If I can take some stuff off of a team's plate and they immediately feel that weight lifted and a breath of fresh air, and I can be that immediate value add, awesome. But I really like the done with you solutions, if you will. So when I say, I like to come in and just partner and be that true partner with a team, and ask the questions and look where no one's looking, and not to make anyone feel silly or if we're not noticing some things, but there's no substitute for asking, like I said.
Right. Right, good. So you work alongside fractional leaders to support their clients. So tell me, how do your services complement theirs, and what makes these partnerships work so well?
Right. I really like a good hub and spoke model. I mean, I've constantly been saying throughout staffing, throughout, agency days, throughout corporate, even into, the startup world, where it's collaboration over competition for me. I am made better by the people I collaborate with, and I bring a really, really strong TA mind to the table. But I am not the only giant that should be holding up that TA strategy. If I don't know who my partners would be in, the talent management or even, L&D space, and I don't know who to bring in for, other advisory functions, and even marketing, and, the technology side of things. I have spent a lot of time building out that list of partners, and being able to know who to call when we need what. So that only makes me better as a fractional leader. And again, it's about not hoarding those resources and saying, this is mine, can't stay out of mine. There's more than enough at the table. I love when I hear that phrase, that there's more than enough work to support the unique needs of these companies. And they might look different year over year or quarter to quarter, but I'm going to always have a lot of tools in my back pocket and a lot of partners. And I also need to sharpen my own brain by staying connected with those people that know how to look at it from a different perspective, at the same issue or the same challenges that we're seeing in our clients' companies.
Yeah, I know fractional leaders are in a very unique position because they're not employees, they're partners.
Yeah.
If their mindset is in the right spot,
Right.
they should be positioning themselves as partners to CEOs and business owners. In which case, their word and their recommendations um, come with a lot of weight.
Right.
And so, being able to say, I know Tiffany Dougherty, she's
Mhm.
great at this, and she's the person, and we need to hire some good people, and blah blah blah.
Right.
So, like, it's always good to have good HR people and good talent acquisition people in your back pocket if you're
Right, right. And similarly for
if
me,
you're in another
keeping those
fractional
people
role.
close. Yeah, I mean, there's
Yes.
a few of them on this call where I keep some of them very close, so that way we know what's going on in each other's professional worlds and sometimes personal
Yeah.
worlds as well. So we know who to call on. But it goes further than a land and expand initiative for me, from a sales perspective. It's about the fact that when I'm trusted to come in and work with a team, if I see something, I'm going to say something. And I'm not just going to say, well, figure it out. I'm off doing this. You've got me, maxed out with my bandwidth over here. I'm going to know for myself what, a collaborative structure looks like and how to bring people in. And that value add initially is what kind of earns me the trust or maybe gets my foot in the door and they can give me a little bit more of the keys to other kingdoms. But I have a lot of great partners to bring in along with that.
That's great. So tell me a little bit about some of the successes you had. Can you give me
Yeah.
an example of something, a customized TA strategy that you've implemented?
Yeah, I mean, whether it was from, my light industrial staffing days, that was, everyone's trying to gobble for those opportunities in the Chicago suburbs, these large manufacturing clients. Or if I was in corporate and we just had these ebbs and flows of different departments, depending on seasonal needs, or even working in the startup space. We were looking at very, very challenging economic times, unprecedented things that we'd never dealt with before. So I felt like tiered strategies, as I mentioned before, was my go-to. Even back then, I didn't know to call it that back then. But I would come in and say, what's reasonable to do first? What do I reasonably have the bandwidth to do? Where are the resources to get this done? But there were some great successes with, in recent years, especially since the pandemic, in helping companies grow and scale and sort of build the plane as we fly it without crash landings. Okay, love saying that. And that phrase used to just incite fear and panic to any recruiting team. It's like building the plans we fly it meant you had to be resourceful and you had to just figure it out. But really, with a couple of companies that were part of a private equity firm's portfolio, I was able to come in and say, okay, we've got these huge, gargantuan Q1 hiring initiatives. Let's figure out who we need to cover down with. And I brought in some, external partners to some of these opportunities and said, hey, I trust this person. They know this industry like the back of their hand. I could learn it. I was often dealing with, industries that I'd never touched before. The weirder, the better sometimes it was. So I would bring in those specialized recruiting partners and say, hey, we want to get them on our team and we want to find a collaboration point because they're going to get us what we need quicker. I also would take on some of the higher priority initiatives and take the pressure out of the pot, out of the cooker, it's like, I'll chomp this down. Let's give the rest of this and divvy this up with the rest of the team, the recruiters, whether we needed contract or in-house recruiting support. And then, I would look at, what the functions are that are supporting this sourcing and screening process. So it's kind of I had to have multiple plates spinning. I had to have a few different brains going at the same time. But again, there's that collaboration point that's always going to be key for me. It's being very simple. It's not always easy. I remember a partner saying that. He's like, just because it's, simple doesn't mean it's easy. I'm like, you're right, heard and understood. But making sure that it feels simple and easy to say yes to. I don't want to ever have a client say, that sounds like a lot, Tiffany. Like it's a lot up here, but I don't need to overwhelm them with all that's up here in my brain. I just want it to seem simple and strategic for us to move in a very moderated, strategic kind of way to put everything in place. But tiered strategies are always the go-to for me. Let's start where you're at and build from there. Let's not throw the whole kitchen sink at you.
Are there any um, sort of tried and true methods that you find translate well as you go from client to client?
Yeah, I feel that whatever keys I've been given, right? If I'm given the marching orders to implement an applicant tracking system, that's a common one. Or if I've been given, some really high priority positions or executive search work, and they're like, just do this, do that. I always like to start with, that intake for either the hiring team, the recruiting team, or the hiring manager. Um, I find that there's a lot of recruiting teams and a lot of processes, a lot of companies that are trying to grow really quickly that don't have that. They'll just have HR talk with the hiring manager, and HR will give it to TA, and then TA will pass it down to the recruiters, and the recruiters will talk with it gets all disjointed. So I feel like those collaboration points are really important. So at least having a manager intake meeting or some sort of kickoff, and then having some sort of clarity on timeline, time to fill. Other things, sort of again, looking more big picture. If you were to ask me to hire for, these positions coming up in Q1, right? I would start doing what I call talent mapping earlier in the year, just to do a little research, just to make sure that the recruiting teams are primed for where to look, what to do, what kind of talent acquisition strategies work for this particular group of people that you're trying to find. And you can set yourself up for success. Don't gatekeep information when it comes to hiring plans. Don't mistake the fact that it's a succession planning initiative, and you're looking at performance management again on the HR side of the house, and not sharing that information with your talent acquisition professionals, because if they're worth their weight, any recruiter should know, better than some HR professionals, where to find the right talent if they've been doing it for long enough.
Okay. I'm going to open the floor up before I ask you the final question.
Right. Perfect.
Yeah, does anybody in the audience have any questions for Tiffany? Please say yes. They're all quiet and muted. Oh my God.
They're stunned by the
I'll
brilliance of
I'll
our
start
conversation,
then.
right?
Yes, exactly. It's the brilliance of it all.
Hi, Anita.
I think the other person had a question, so.
Sure.
No, you activated your video even. Go for it, Anita.
Oh,
I'll go
no,
next.
no. I just, the chaos calmed down. So I'm still formulating, but please, Clarissa.
Okay. So Tiffany, I am also in the HR space, right? Like I think it's interesting as you present the talent acquisition in HR, right? And even coming from agencies, right? Like I feel like I have worked with enough recruiters to understand that they don't usually go as deep, right? So how do you when you are invited to help, for instance, like hey, review the C-level, review executives for the company that you're being hired to, um, what stage of the business are you when you're looking for that, or even considering that you're focusing more on the TA and the reviews and creating processes? What is your sales process, or even like how do you get to these resources that you are moving forward with?
Sure. That's a great question. I've often partnered with leadership advisory firms, or been connected in with venture capital or private equity firms. So they already have a bit of a forward-facing growth mind to all of this, and they know that the person that they hire for this stage of their recruiting strategy is not going to be the same for a person at their next stage. So like the 50 to 250 stage, if you were to look at size of companies, so 50 to 250 employees, is very different than say 500 to 1,000, right? So just knowing that they bring me in at a time that's usually high growth, and instead of just hiring a run-of-the-mill recruiter, they're a dime a dozen, and they all have their own functions. They're all good at their own things. Hiring a true TA partner, and someone that looks a little bit more big picture, I can often give them a good sell with, yes, I can do this. Let's stop the bleeding here, or let's put out this fire, and address this pain point that you have. But then there's going to be a more holistic approach. That's often why I haven't been the best fit for some companies that are like, we just have hair on fire needs, and we just are all in dumpster fires, and we're just losing our minds. I'm like, okay, I can give you some great recruiters that'll come in and fill those positions, get butts in seats, and do it well. They're not just gonna, fill and bill and be gone. They're gonna do that for you. But if you want to talk strategy, and if you want to talk scalability and sustainability in your processes, so that way you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you're coming up against a high growth stage, that's what I'm here for. So I don't want to misrepresent myself as just like, yeah, bring Tiffany in, she'll do the recruiting, she'll get us our Q1 hiring numbers met, you know, and then the private equity firm and the venture capital firm will be happy that we've grown and we'll get more money. You know, like, don't bring me in for that. That's going to be a limitation of my service and support to you and your team. So I think it's just about knowing what value I add, but then what else I can do, like how I can land and expand and really accelerate the success of these teams and expand the influence of you know, a good TA strategy.
And in these examples, like you mentioned, like in the 50 to 250 growth stage, do you often partner with recruiting firms, especially as you're going for the strategic as to what you truly need and not necessarily the task of hiring?
Absolutely. I have quite a few really strong partners that, you know, were considered external partners. So I've come into companies where they've just kind of opened up the floodgates, and every agency that's ever worked with a hiring manager at that company is in their system and submitted candidates. And it's not only you know, overinflating the hiring costs, because those fees are sometimes quite large, but it's also you know, too choppy. It's not strategic enough for me. So I'm not here to kick out all the external agencies, but I had a, you know, a CEO that, or a chief HR officer that had hired me say, you need to tell people that you help them to reduce or refine the spend on those external partnerships, and you focus on efficiency. I was like, oh, I never realized that. Actually, yeah, I do that because I've been where they've been. I've been the external partner, so I know what right looks like. And then also, of course, I stay close to industry partners in areas of high competition. So when we're talking about tech talent, I need a specific tech agency person that I trust, that's not just going to send me the same candidates that they've sent to 5 different companies and, you know, just going to try to throw stuff over the wall and see what sticks. I need to know that I trust the people that I work with. That trust factor is so key for me. So absolutely, working with external partnerships, I think it's collaboration over competition. I want them to feel just as supported by me as I am by them. And that produces a better result, because at the end of the day, I'm only one person. And sometimes with these startups, they don't have the budget to hire you know, 3 to 4 to 10, you know, internal people on their recruiting team, but that's the size of their hiring needs. So that's when you got to get creative and be open to bringing in external partnerships, contract recruiters that know how to do it the way that the company's culture aligns with, not just come in and do it their way and then they leave and we've got a mess on our hands. So there's a lot of different ways to slice that pie from a recruiting perspective.
Yeah, thank you. We're very, very aligned in the way we think,
Yeah.
especially like when you think of the big companies, like you said, that they just throw a position out there to 40 agencies.
Right.
I feel like that's something that I would have zero desire to even focus on.
Right.
I'm all
Well, and
about
when,
like, hey, working with the TA team, working with the hiring manager to truly understand what is
right.
a fit, instead of like, oh, these are the 3 skills. Get someone that
Right.
knows how to do this.
Right. And I've in corporate, you know, I worked with a lot of those, you know, RPO models and a lot of the external partnerships. I think there was up to 80 at one point in time for all these different, you know, corporate recruiting initiatives that we had on the plate. I'm like, who did this? I don't like, this is the definition of herding cats, as we hear all the time. This is a lot, you know. So it doesn't have to be so robust and so complex that it gets convoluted, but it does have to make sense. Another one of my favorite phrases that actually came from my first job working at Starbucks is like, common sense is a very valuable currency. And I'm going to try to bring it into every conversation I have, but some people aren't using that currency as well as they should, right?
That's right. Does anyone else have any questions or comments?
Yeah, so I'd love to understand how you think about the candidate experience, especially as we see more people flooding the market,
Right.
and how you're seeing that show up differently, Tiffany, what that looks like for you moving forward and all of us moving forward as, you know, maybe 100 candidates becomes 1,000 candidates.
Right.
But and what they're coming out of, because that, as you and I have talked before, that candidate experience becomes even more important as federal workers start to flood the marketplace, et cetera. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, shameless plug for Anita here, she and I have had in-depth conversations about, her area of expertise in psychological safety and trauma-informed hiring and practices, and then looking at the other side and how to support an individual, knowing what their, key contributors to some of their chaos internally and externally, how that presents, how that shows up. And I can't tell you how many times I've had this conversation with recruiting teams and even hiring managers that are just blithely unaware of the human-centric processes that you have as a support to the recruiting function. If you are, again, back to our first question, it's not just an execution initiative. Recruiting is, a mindful talent acquisition strategy to augment the culture of your company. And if you're not clear on what that phrase just meant, or if you're like, that sounds like a word salad that Tiffany just spit out, there's the problem. Therein lies the problem. So we're forgetting that there are humans in this process, and they're not just number of applicants and time to fill and, this many interviews equals this many selected hires and, things like that. So that's why numbers and I have a very complex relationship. But the way that I've seen it change over the years is that, you've got recruiters who are also humans in their own right that are flooded, overwhelmed, I dare say burnt out with the amount of work that's being plopped on their plate. And then they are kind of taking the brunt of the blowback. I myself have been torched on a Glassdoor review for, the shortcomings of the recruiting process that I walked into. But also looking at, again, the human-centric process. If you don't have a, candidate survey throughout your process, get one. I know it's kind of scary to ask for that feedback, and you don't want to be, you might be a little reticent about asking, especially if it was a bad experience, but there's no substitute for asking. Again, like, you have to know where some of those pain points are. And the way that I've seen recruiting teams react to this volume, just at very, very least the volume, and then the expectation and the pressure and the very chaotic, I'm not saying that they're all empaths, but they can probably feel the stress of this hiring market right now. So to look at their stress and the workload that they're absorbing, I think that it becomes extremely important to give them support functions as well, whether it's addressing your applicant tracking system or your tools for sourcing, screening, and selecting the right talent. Don't just assume that every recruiter should come in knowing what the next one knows or knowing the best ways to support the recruiting functions of your business. That's a mindful, concerted effort. And if you're not being mindful about it, it's bound to go off the rails. So I think that there's a little bit on, focusing on the candidate, giving them the good support and treating them as humans, not just a number. What's reasonable. There's oftentimes a simple things you can incorporate in the process to support them, and then support your recruiting teams. Like, don't treat them like the admins of the process. Really help them to show their best work and be proud of the people that they're placing in your organization. Because if they're proud and if they're excited about bringing great talent to your company, that alone in a recruiting process will amplify any of the culture, any of the success rates of all these numbers that I just mentioned before. That seems to be like when a recruiter is engaged and when they're excited about what you're doing, that's the magic sauce for me.
So how many companies do you think, I mean, this, you may or may not have the stats on this, but feel free to ballpark. How many companies do you think deliberately hire for cultural fit? Right?
Yeah,
Because it's important, right? A lot of the time you hire people and then you try to make them fit your culture rather than looking for the people who have the right mindset to begin with and the qualifications.
Yeah,
Which
that's
is harder,
such a
right?
yeah. I mean, yeah, it's really I try to look at it from a process base. Like, it's sort of a hard for me to do because we get so wrapped up in the passionate topics of it. Like, this is the culture, right? And I think that I remember hearing in corporate someone saying that culture is a lens, and if we're all not looking through the same lens, we're all going to be very confused as to what the culture should look like. And I've seen some companies that are so about the numbers and the top line initiatives that they don't really think about how each team or each person is interpreting the culture of the company. So that, the hiring processes, everything down to like the criteria, the core selection criteria for a job description or for a screening tool for candidates can get very wonky. So I think that if you were to ask me about like the number of companies that are hiring with culture in mind, I think most of them would say they are. Who is actually doing that well? Like at 3 out of 10, like 3 out of 10 are doing it well, which is a huge disparity. That's a gross ballpark of it. And then again, those three that are doing it well could have, a huge change, with the different, economic, political changes and things like that. And that could go out the window, and they could have a whole other culture cycle, if you will, on their hands. So I think it's important to have those culture conversations at all levels. Don't just keep it at the C-suite. Don't just keep it, to the team manager level. Really, really make sure that that's a thread that goes up and down and left and right, and it doesn't get talked about enough, really. Is it, that doesn't get left out of any of the conversation. So I'll oftentimes point to a culture assessment for assessing that current state. A culture assessment is a really great tool, but oftentimes people want to do the assessment on their TA strategy or their recruiting process, and I'm like, I tricked you, because that's laced into it. But culture is something you should assess early, often, and always, for me.
I'd like to ask you one more question, if that's okay.
Sure.
And it's going to seem like a dumb question, but it takes all kinds of people to make a company successful. You can't have everybody all the same, right? It takes a lot of different types of people. So then I wonder, is being a team player kind of overrated? Because we have, for example, people who are on the spectrum are not naturally team players, but they have a lot to offer. And they often get pushed out of the recruitment process because they don't fit in the box.
Right.
But
Right.
so is the question is being a team player overrated, or is it really, really, really important in the growth of a company? I know it's got its place, but does
Right.
everybody need to be a team player?
Yeah, this will light up a whole different part of the Christmas tree in my brain, right? Because it's about the DEI initiatives. It's about
Yes,
how
well,
we
that's a whole
show
other
up
thing.
in the market to attract
Yeah,
the right talent. It's not
yeah.
how, we check a box and we hired this many of this type of people. It's about finding the right talent and knowing that talent, the diversity in and of itself, is going to enhance the collective fabric of your organization, if you will. They're going to look at things from a different perspective than you will. But this started for me early on. I just, again, always had that naturally inquisitive mind. But when I remember working with some of the ERGs in corporate, and I kind of became this talent acquisition liaison to all of these diversity groups. And I said, what is the biggest pain point for you? And there was a disabilities employment resource group that said, people don't know how to hire for people on the spectrum. And so I did an unconscious bias training. That's where I started. That was my nascent stage, diversity brain, right? And then I went further, and I got into markets with, Chicago House and different LGBT organizations. And I worked with, a trans work seminar that addressed the needs for that specific community. And they said, how can we find companies that are here to support us? I'm like, well, that's not all their responsibility. Part of it's yours. Let's look at what that looks like. So to your question of, is it a bad thing for everyone to be a team player? Or, are you kind of selling yourself short by just saying, yeah, I can work with anybody, everybody? I think that it's about knowing what your skills are, and knowing where you fit. I'm not for everybody. I'm not for everybody's team. I would not work well in certain structures with certain types of managers. And I've proven my point time and time again with that. When I'm put in positions to work with people that, we are not aligning. I feel like I don't want to open the can of worms around assessment tools, but I feel like they're really great performance management tools if they're used correctly. I think that they're really great to be able to identify what key strengths and maybe some challenges that this person might have in this role. But I remember one, I won't say their name, just to kind of keep this open, in terms of the types of assessment tools you can use. But there was one that identifies someone's candidate archetype, if you will. And they said, if you are this type of person, you're going to be more of a centrist, or you're going to be on this side of the spectrum or that side. You know, maybe you're a leader, maybe you're more behind the scenes person. And you can have really great leaders on your team. You need those, you know. But if you're hiring only leaders and you're hiring culture clones, you're going to have a problem very quickly culturally, and especially internally in that team. Hiring people that are centrist, that can flex one way or the other, and say, I can step into leadership, I can own a project if I need to, but I also can flex this way, is good. And then having people that are going to cover down on that side. I once saw the culture profiles for every single person that this team had hired, and let's put it out there, they were doing well. They were like the team to beat, right? And they were all in this one singular, they only had one profile for every single person on the team. And I said, that's not good. That's not good. And I don't want to say I told you so later, but you need to get some other people in there that can be more centrist, right? Or just to fill out, because ducks like hiring ducks and they don't understand geese. And you're looking at a team that doesn't know how to hire anything other than a duck, you know? And sure enough, it was less than a year later, we started to see 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 more of those people leaving the team, because you can't have, you know, all of these vying personalities in one profile type and one stage. And they're just not being set up for success if they're all being put in the same position to do the same thing. So team player mentality is, of course, going to be expected in most company cultures. It can't be all about you all the time. But sometimes you need those people that can kind of invigorate a team and really push them to maybe go outside of their comfort zone. And sometimes they just need to be off by themselves to go do what they need to do, and they can do it well. There's a whole other lens, a whole other tapestry, if you will. We need multiple colors. I don't want just one texture, one color, one thing. And we can all imagine what that, analogy plays out to. It's a really boring company culture, and it's really toxic. And people won't feel comfortable and won't feel like they can bring their full selves and all that they want to the business.
Yeah, you need people who can lead, follow, and get out of the way.
Right. Sometimes all on the same day.
So before we wrap up, for founders and fractional leaders listening, who might want to work with you or refer you, what would be the best step for them to take?
Yeah, I would say the first step, as I've set up as part of my process, is that current state assessment. I think booking an initial call with me just to talk about what your company's doing. I love getting excited. And again, my brain lights up like a Christmas tree to be able to support those initiatives. But let's start with assessing current state. Let's look at where you're at, what some of those pain points are. And then we can develop tiered solutions. We can look at what current state looks like and maybe where you want to go in a very short amount of time. And I can give you some resources, whether it's DIY or done with you or done for you solutions. And then finally, they're just that collaborative approach. I'd love to collaborate with your teams and let me get in there and work with you. But I think initially the value add for that conversation and just sharing my brain with you would be a great start.
Well, they could find you at ardentservices.com or on LinkedIn, correct? Or in the
Correct.
Fractional Referral Network.
Yep. It's ardentservices.org. And of course you can find me on the LinkedIn through my personal page or through Ardent Services business page as well.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to sign off. Thank you all very much for coming. I'm going to stop that recording. There we go.
Thank you.